Hi guys, welcome to the physiology lecture on fluid and electrolyte physiology. I am your physiology discipline director, Tom Shannon. This lesson is really just an introductory lesson to this topic. We want you guys to have some exposure to how giving replacement fluids affects the human body, and we wanted you to get it relatively early because it's something that you do a lot as a clinician. And it also involves the concept of osmolarity, which we really wanted you guys to get early in the curriculum, and which you've now gotten in a separate lesson. Having said that, this is a topic that really won't be covered fully at bare minimum until you get through the renal lessons later on in the curriculum, when we can really talk more fully about how these electrolytes and how fluid is excreted from the body. And at that point, you'll have all the regulatory mechanisms, all the mechanisms by which the electrolytes are handled by the kidney, and then you can get a more full discussion of this. But for right now, we wanted to sort of introduce you to it, and in particular, we wanted to use what you've already been taught about osmolarity and to apply some of that knowledge. So having said that, let's get started. So when we talk about water balance, really, what we're talking about is that water gain has to equal water loss. You can't constantly be taking in more water than you're getting rid of, otherwise you blow up like a balloon and somebody sticks a pin in you and you bust, which would be a bad thing to happen. So as a result of that, your total body water is pretty much constant. And what that means is that you can't take in more than you lose over a long period of time. Okay, your gains and losses take place in a variety of different ways. Certainly you drink water. I certainly hope you do, and you take in quite a lot of water in food as well. And your metabolism also generates quite a bit of water, as you can see here. And when you add that up, that has to equal your losses. So you lose the majority of your fluids through your urine, and you always generate urine even when your regulatory mechanisms are at a point where you're trying to conserve water to the maximum. You still are going to urinate fluid and lose fluid that way. You lose water through your feces, through your skin, simply through evaporation, because your skin is exposed to the atmosphere. And that does not actually even include sweat, which you lose as a separate category. And then you lose quite a bit of moisture from your lungs. Just again through evaporation, because you're constantly taking in air and breathing it out, hopefully. Otherwise, you won't be watching this for long. Consequences of fluid imbalances. Some examples, if you give IV injections, or if you have somebody hooked up to an IV in a bag, certainly that is a gain of fluid in a variety of different ways, and that can come through an isotonic solution like isotonic saline, or a hypertonic solution, which is saline with sodium chloride, more concentrated than the body, or higher milliosmoles per liter than the body. You have lactated Ringer's solution, which you'll give as a physician. D5W is 5% dextrose in water. That's equivalent to basically giving glucose. Okay. Certainly, you drink water and you take it in through your drinking water. You lose water by vomiting, something that perhaps you're not used to thinking of, but certainly has a huge impact on your physiology. You lose water through diarrhea, and of course, excessive sweating will cause you to lose quite a bit of water as well. The consequences of these sorts of perturbations depend upon the composition of the fluid. And things like pH are going to really affect this. If you're losing a fluid that has a different pH from your body fluids, your plasma, 7.4, then what that's going to do is it's potentially going to change the pH of your body because you're losing too much hydrogen ion. For instance, if the pH of what you're losing is low, like vomit, well, you're losing a lot of hydrogen chloride. You're vomiting up and losing a lot of hydrogen ion, and so that's going to raise the pH of your body. The same thing goes with potassium. If you lose a lot of high potassium solution, you can make yourself hypokalemic or low plasma potassium. The same thing with sodium, and if the solution is not isoosmotic with the plasma, you can literally change the body's osmolarity as well because you're losing either too many particles or too much water, one or the other. They're both bad, okay? So the acid-base effects, like I said, a lot of fluids have a pH different than the plasma. Vomit and diarrhea are two very good examples. This one has a low pH, this has a high pH, and those can affect the pH balance in your body. And this creates a metabolic acidosis or alkalosis. Don't worry too much about what that means, the metabolic in particular means. At this point, that's something that we'll cover later in the curriculum in more depth than you ever wanted to know. The electrolyte effects, mainly sodium and potassium. Potassium is the one you really want to keep an eye on. Changes in the potassium concentration in the plasma can be really dangerous. And if you're losing a bunch of potassium through the loss of fluids, like vomit or something, then that can lead to hypokalemia. And that has some very bad physiological changes, particularly on electrical tissues that generate and conduct action potentials. So think nervous system and heart as very good examples of that. Hyperkalemia is rare, but you can generate hyperkalemia in a normal person. It's rare in a normal person, meaning you're not likely to be losing a lot of solution that's low in potassium, such that you concentrate the potassium all that much. There are mechanisms in place to prevent that, and you have to be pretty sick in order to overwhelm those. Having said that, hyperkalemia does happen for other reasons, just not usually because of the fluid imbalance. Osmotic effects. Any osmotic gradient between fluid compartments basically can't exist. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a second. But if you have a high osmolarity on the outside of the cell and a low osmolarity on the inside of the cell, water will move from inside to outside the cell, and that is going to cause an imbalance. Or it certainly is a consequence of losing, let's say, a whole lot of water. If you lose a lot of water, you concentrate your plasma, you're going to lose cellular water as well. And we're going to talk about that in great depth later in the lesson. Total body water is the sum of the contents of all the water in all the body fluids, in all the body, period. Inside, outside, upside down, okay? So here we have a graph of total body water at different ages, and as you can see, at birth you start with a pretty high total body water as a percent of the total body weight, but then things decline from there in both men and women, okay? So at each age you can see, particularly between 0 months and 6 months, that percentage drops quite a lot. An adult female will have 45 to 50% of her body weight as total body water. Here it's 47 on this graph. For the purposes of calculations in this course, please use 50%. So when we ask you to do some calculations later on, we assume that if you weigh a female, half of that body weight will be body water, okay? For adult males, it's a higher percentage, 55 to 60%. You can see that here. Males are the purple line. Here it's 56. And you use 60% for the calculations in this course, which is a nice round number that will allow you to do those calculations with less trouble. Having said all that, you can see that as a percentage of lean body mass, total body water is pretty constant. So if we're talking about, mass in the body that isn't fat, this green part down here, you're talking about a fairly constant percentage, and some of those percentages for some of these lean organs are here in this table. However, fat kind of messes all this up. And you may wonder, why is the total body water different between men and women? Well, it's because the percentage of the body weight that is fat tends to be variable. And of course, it tends to vary from individual to individual as well. So a very a person that's very fat is going to have, their body water is going to be a lower percentage of their total body weight than a person that's really lean and skinny, because fat has very little water in it. So that's basically, it's basically weight that it doesn't really contribute to the total body water. And so as a result, what it's really doing is it's inflating the body weight, and therefore the total body, the percentage that's total body water will drop if there's a lot of fat around. All right? The distribution between the water and the intracellular and extracellular fluid is 40-60. 40% extracellular, 60% intracellular. So if you have the total body water, 40% of that total will be in the extracellular compartment, 60% will be in the intracellular compartment. Okay, and again, that'll be relevant to calculations that we are going to do later. But do note there's more water inside the cells than outside the cells. Okay. The barriers, that is the cell membranes between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid, are very permeable to water. And what that means, and they're not very permeable to some solutes like sodium. We're going to talk about sodium in a minute. And as a result, water will move across these membranes whenever there is a difference in the osmolarity between the inside of the cells and the outside of the cells. And it's going to move until that osmolarity is the same on both sides of the membrane. The membrane can't stop the water, and so if there's a gradient for water, that is, if you have a high osmolarity on one side and a low osmolarity on the other, water will flow across the membrane. And that happens pretty much everywhere in the body, as far as I know, except the kidney, in certain cells in the kidney, and we'll worry about that at a later date. Okay? So, bear in mind that if the solutes can't move across the membrane, water will, and it's going to move until the osmolarity is the same on both sides. So, that is exactly what this says. You can't sustain an osmotic difference between the inside of the cells and the outside of the cells. Water is going to move down its gradient from low osmolarity to high osmolarity until the osmolarity is the same. Okay? And what that means is that if you know the plasma osmolarity, and I think that's what that says somewhere in here. Anyway, if all body fluids, everything inside the skin, have the same osmolarity, then what that means is that all you have to do is measure the plasma osmolarity, and you'll know what the osmolarity is everywhere else. Inside the cells, interstitial fluid, everywhere. Okay, because there can't be water gradients, all right? So, the osmotic concentration difference is established by the cell impermeable solutes. In other words, if the solutes can't cross the membrane to even out the osmotic difference, then water will, all right? And that's all that this says. If it's a cell permeable solute, then the cell permeable solute will just move and water won't have to move, okay? So urea is a very common cell permeable solute. Very important to kidney function. Again, we'll talk about that someday when we decide that you have to know that. Up until then, just be glad you don't have to. if I add urea to the extracellular fluid, because it can easily cross membranes, it's going to cross to the intracellular fluid, and eventually I'll have the same concentration of urea on both sides. If that is the case, water won't move, because it doesn't have to. The osmotic difference corrects itself just by the urea moving, and so the osmotic concentration on both sides ends up being the same without moving any water at all. Okay? So cell-permeant solutes don't really help with establishing an osmotic gradient across a membrane. Sodium, as I said, is effectively cell impermeable. It actually can get across cell membranes. There are channels there. But whatever gets across gets pumped right back out again. So the gradient for sodium is established and maintained. And because of that, it's effectively cell impermeable. It effectively can't get across the membranes because it just pumped right back out again. And that concentration difference is maintained. So sodium doesn't just diffuse across the membrane until there's an equal concentration of sodium on one side and sodium on the other, like urea does. Instead, if you add sodium to the extracellular fluid, the plasma, let's say through an IV, sounds medically relevant, that sodium can't get across the membrane, all right? Effectively, it can't get across, okay? The concentration here is maintained. And so, because of that, you have an osmotic gradient. High sodium here, no sodium here, high osmolarity here, lower osmolarity here. The sodium can't move to correct that gradient, so water will. And water, as a result of this, moves out of the cell from inside to outside. It dilutes the sodium and the other particles in the extracellular fluid, and it does that until the osmolarity is equal on both sides, okay? And so what you get here, really, as you can see, is if you have less intracellular fluid, you've gotten cell shrinkage is what's happened, okay? All right. So I'm going to cut that off right there, and we'll pick it up in the next video and continue on with this lesson.